Hey, what's up guys, you got Gypsy, and today I'm back bringing you guys a video that I've been thinking about making for a couple of weeks now. I'm going to be discussing Galarian Weezing and why I think this mon might potentially be a real titan in the Generation 8 Sword and Shield Draft League meta, whatever that turns out to be. So I'm going to be covering the reasons for why I think it's going to be so good in a second, but before that we're going to jump into a bit of a breakdown of what its stat spread could potentially look like. So I've just I've copied just a regular standard Kanto Weezing's stat spread. I'm imagining that Galarian Weezing will receive some sort of stat distribution changes, much like we saw with the Alolan forms. But even if it doesn't, or even if it does, I wouldn't imagine it's going to change too drastically. You might see it gain more Speed F, being a Fairy type. Fairies tend to have better Speed F than their Phys Def overall, so you could see potentially its special defense stat increase, maybe its Phys Def stat drop a little bit. I wouldn't mind seeing its Speed F rise to about 100 if its defense were to fall to 100 too. But that base 120 Phys Def is a real selling point of Weezing as a defensive mon in the first place, and would really appreciate that high Phys Def to stick around in this Galarian form too. So we'll have to see. I don't think its HP stat will increase. I think that doesn't really tend to happen in these regional variants, but if it did, that would be incredible. I think that would turn this thing into an even better mon than I think it's going to be. But if we look at the coverage, and I do think its Galarian form will receive some new moves, potentially Moonblast, maybe something like Dazzling Gleam, but some sort of Fairy Stab, potentially even some kind of new Fairy move that we haven't seen yet. But even so, just like referring to its standard move spread from the regular Kanto Weezing, T-Spikes is huge. This is huge for any team. Obviously, it's one of the big selling points of Kanto Weezing, and the Galarian form of Weezing being able to be a T-Spike absorber for many teams, assuming you're running Neutralizing Gas, which is going to be a major selling point for this mon in the draft format, and I'm going to go into why I think that is the case soon. But yeah, forfeiting Levitate for Neutralizing Gas means that it will lose its ground immunity in Levitate, but it will gain the ability to soak up T-Spikes, which is a pretty massive role for most teams in draft. They are definitely going to want something to soak up those T-Spikes, because if you can abuse T-Spikes against a team that doesn't have a ground and poison, it becomes a headache to prep for. You really do have to account for it with removal, with stuff like Defog. If you don't have a poison, grounded poison, and it just becomes a bit of a headache if you don't prepare for it. It can quickly turn games around. So yeah, the combination of T-Spikes, whilst Weezing also has the potential to remove T-Spikes of its own, is pretty huge in my opinion. We see moves like Sludge Bomb, pretty high base power stab if it gets Moonblast as well, which I wouldn't be surprised to see happen. Those are going to be two fairly decent high-powered stabs with solid secondary effects. Sludge Bomb with the poison and Moonblast with the special attack drop is going to be pretty nice. But let's talk about the Poison Fairy typing. So this typing lets it become an even better fighting check. It does gain an unfortunate weakness to Steel typing, though offensive steals aren't that common. You don't really see like offensive steals used that much in draft. It's a fantastic defensive typing, but as far as offensive typing goes, it's pretty limited in what it can hit super effectively. It's not one of the more splashable typings, which we do tend to see spammed a lot, like Fighting or Water or Ice, even Fairy. It's more of a sort of a defensive typing. So gaining a weakness to Steel in exchange for gaining an immunity to Dragon, a resistance to Dark, Bug. It now 4 times resists Bug, as well as 4 times resisting Fighting, is pretty incredible. Its Poison typing also helping it against Fairies, so it's like a real Fairy Dragon killer, potentially, with its dual typing. And then we see Pain Split for pretty viable recovery with its lowish base HP. It's not low, but it's not amazing. Like base 90 HP on this mon would be incredible. It would really be incredible on this mon. But 65, assuming it does stay around that, it's okay. It's better than something like Rotom, and it can definitely take advantage of the way the Pain Split mechanic works. So Spreading wisps with this thing, I see like toxic and wisp spam with this being pretty amazing in a lot of situations on a lot of teams. But yeah, if we also look at its offensive stats, like there's nothing to scoff at. I wouldn't be surprised to see its phys def fall. Sorry, its physically offensive stat, its attack stat fall in its Galarian form. I could see that. Again, fairies tend not to have the best physically offensive stats, much like their physically defensive stats. They're more specially orientated, and I could see like a special attack boost up to something like 90 or 95, with the attack dropping to something like 75. That could definitely, that's definitely something I could envision, and would make sense given the kind of the theme that fairies tend to follow so far in the series. But that would actually really make Galarian Weezing almost sort of comparable to Clefable in the way that it acts as a defensive check to a lot of mons. It's a very splashable defensive check, but it also has a very potent, like naturally high special attack stat that, when combined with high-powered stabs in Moonblast, are really kind of annoying for offensive mons to switch into. And it has the bulk to take on defensive and to kind of abuse defensive cores with ease. So if we could see a special attack increase on Galarian Weezing, I think that would just bump it up that much higher. But I'm going to pause the video now, and we're going to get into the kind of real meat of this video, why I think this mon is kind of being slept on a little bit, and its real potential that I see for it in the draft format. Alright guys, now we're going to jump into the reasons why I think Galarian Weezing is going to be such a staple, such a powerhouse in the new Sword and Shield Draft League meta. So this is all centered around Galarian Weezing's new ability, Neutralizing Gas, and for those of you guys who don't know, the way it works is it actually negates the opponent's ability, which, you know, when you first hear it, you think, yeah, that sounds pretty cool, that sounds pretty, it's sort of like an upgraded mold breaker from Excadrill. But the more you think about it, and the more you kind of deep dive into how ability reliant certain mons are in the Draft League format, and in Pokemon in general, you start to realize that, combined with Galarian Weezing's typing, is pretty significant. So we're going to jump into a few examples here. I've got a few different teams here. They're not teams, but selections of mons, and I'm going to be talking about why I think Galarian Weezing is going to be significant towards each of these mons. So we're going to kick it off with the Tapus here. So Tapus, real powerhouses, real mainstays of the Gen 7 draft format. They really did shake it up and create a lot of different playstyles around them. Lele with Psychic Spam, Coco with Volt Turn into powerful megas like Gallade and Mega Metachan. We had Bulu Grass Spam with Katana, and just like as a nice defensive pivot on a lot of teams. And of course Tapu Fini, the the love of Aki's life, and the one of the premier defoggers, honestly, and bulky offensive mons in the draft meta. So let's look at how Galarian Weezing impacts these mons. So being able to actually remove each of their surges, being able to negate each of their specific terrains is going to be huge. If the mechanic does work that way, which we've got reason to believe it does based on the videos we've seen of it negating other mons' abilities in battle, this is going to turn... obviously Lele will still threaten Weezing offensively with Psychic, but if it actually cancels out the terrain, as opposed to just rendering it useless while Weezing is in, if it actually cancels it out, we could see Weezing as being a sort of anti-terrain pivot versus teams with these with the Tapus, which is huge, because a lot of teams centered around like Coco Lucha, Coco Medi, Coco Gallade really do rely on that terrain support in order to break opposing teams. You know, Bulu without terrain is significantly weaker. It doesn't have that longevity with the grassy terrain restoring its health. A Fini that can't protect itself from status and its team makes from status really does lose some of its viability. So I think definitely against the Tapus, some of the real offensive kind of powerhouses of this generation, Weezing looks pretty nice. And even from a defensive standpoint, Galarian Weezing does a fantastic job in checking Tapu Bulu. It checks Tapu Fini pretty nicely, especially if it does get a special defense boost. Coco, obviously, T-Bolts are still going to hurt, but without the electric terrain up, Coco is significantly weaker, and especially defensive Galarian Weezing can comfortably 1v1 Coco with Sludge Bomb and Pain Split, stuff like that. So yeah, I think versus these guys, it's definitely going to be a nuisance for them to try and overcome. And then we get into some more interesting stuff. So now we have Clefable. Now, Clef, as we all know, Clef, one of the greatest fairies to ever exist in Mons in general. One of the best fairies in the format, without a doubt. It's very well known for its Carmine sets, its Carmine soft-boiled sets with Magic Guard. This is really what makes Clef such a nuisance to take on. You don't tend to see a lot of Unaware in the format. Magic Guard is just the superior ability in most cases, allowing it to avoid hazard damage, any sort of extra non-direct damage against it. It can disguise Life Orb, stuff like that. So, alright, so factoring in that a lot of Clefable's success in the format is heavily dependent on its ability Magic Guard, the ability for Weezing's neutralizing gas to just prevent that ability from working is huge, and it really does threaten Clef in terms of being the just reliable, safe pivot that it does tend to be in a lot of games. Being able to actually Toxic Clef, especially with the way that Toxic works with Magic Guard when the Magic Guard ability has been removed, is going to be really interesting. If you think about, like say you'd set up 2 layers of T-Spikes with Galarian Weezing, or you'd manage to throw out a Toxic on a Clef with a different teammate earlier on in the game. Now if you get to a point in the late game where Clef is, it's got a couple of Carmines under its belt, or maybe it's using Cosmic Power, either way it's been a real nuisance, it's been in for a long time, and you throw out Weezing into the field and negating its Magic Guard, it's going to be taking the compounded toxic damage that it otherwise would have dodged thanks to Magic Guard, all because of Weezing's new ability. That's massive. That is huge. That really does limit the effectiveness of Carmine Clef, and also the next one here, Carmine Reuniclus. Now Reuniclus obviously can threaten Weezing offensively with Psychic, but the point stands that the ability for Toxic to actually compound up on these Mons and quietly in the back whilst Magic Guard prevents them from taking damage, it's still accumulating the compounding effect of Toxic. So the second neutralizing gas takes effect when Weezing comes in and negates Magic Guard at the end of the turn. You're going to see those Mons taking a huge amount of residual at the end of the turn, which could be massive. But we could see like Weezing's speed creeping Clefs in order to outspeed it, preventing it from recovering up after taking that massive Toxic. A lot of theory mining there, but the way in which it can disrupt the typical playstyle that Clef uses really kind of sort of take advantage of Clef being able to dodge all that residual damage. I really do think Galarian Weezing has the potential to just really disrupt Clef. Apart from the fact that it just naturally checks it with its poison typing, we might see obviously Clef can take on like Psychic or something like that. But that being said, that's another move slot that it has to be concerned about. We could see, like I mentioned earlier, Galarian Weezing getting a Spadef boost, and with stuff like Pain Split and Toxic, it really can just 1v1 Clef, which is very interesting. So it's gonna be really cool to see how it does affect bulkier playstyles like Clef, because Clef is usually a cornerstone in fatter builds. I know I've really enjoyed using Clef in the past, and Clef does really flourish on a sort of semi-stall or a bulkier approach. It can work on bulky offense, but it does appreciate having other sort of fat bulwarks in the back, which are able to take some of the pressure off Clef. And I feel like Clef functions best when it doesn't need to be a certain check to something, when it has the flexibility of being able to be a sort of team player across the board. So yeah, I think Galarian Weezing is going to spell big problems for Clef potentially at this early point, but we'll have to see when we get into the actual meta. But next up we've got Reuni, and I just touched on it earlier then. Again, Magic Guard is the ability you tend to see used, but obviously Reuni does have access to regen, which I'm going to touch on a bit later in the video. But again, just removing this thing's ability to dodge status with Magic Guard, just neutralizing that, and oftentimes Reuniclus and Clef do switch into status, and they love to switch in on Skulls, but if you build in such a way with Galarian Weezing on your team that you're throwing out Toxics in an attempt to catch either of these two fat Magic Guard abusers, you can potentially use Weezing in a pivot later in the game to get that toxic damage off versus Reuniclus disabling its Magic Guard. So that's a pretty interesting approach there with Reuni. But we're going to jump into the next category here, and this is going to really touch on some of the more offensive threats in the draft meta. So we're going to start with Dougie. Now Dougie, Dougie. So this mon here, Arena Trap, one of the reasons, it's pretty much the only reason why this thing is viable apart from its speed. But obviously not being able to trap Weezing is going to be huge, because if you opt to run neutralizing gas, you're obviously not going to have levitate, meaning you'd be vulnerable to trapping. But being able to disable trapping means that you're always going to be able to switch. It's not like he can pursue you for any meaningful chip. Being resistant to that, it's going to be huge. Obviously negating Dugtrier's effectiveness essentially versus Weezing. Then we have Sableye. Sableye won't have magic bounce. It cannot it can't bounce back T-spikes that Galarian Weezing may want to set up versus Sableye. We also may see Galarian Weezing pick up a Fairy Stab, which could be obviously quite nice against Mega Sableye. I think what would be amazing is if we saw Galarian Weezing pick up a boosting option. I think Calm Mind might be asking a bit too much, but I don't know, we'll see. There might be some sort of move distributions, maybe even work up or something like that, which could be interesting, giving it a really nice offensive presence versus Fatamons like Sableye. But even so, with a special attack boost and Fairy Stab, it is going to pose a threat to this mon. Not that you see this mon at all really in draft, but you know, in draft tournaments it does make an appearance. Next up we have Gliss. Gliss obviously will be able to threaten neutralizing gas Weezing with EQ. However, it's going to neutralizing gas is going to turn Glisscore's best ability Poison Heal against it by actually forcing it to take poison damage each turn. So that's pretty massive. That is pretty big indeed. I think Glisscore is not the same mon without its Poison Heal. It's obviously, that's a big selling point in this mon, and yeah, just being able to turn that around and actually punish it is going to be pretty huge. We could see, you know, Galarian Weezing's running Protect as well to abuse these ability reliant mons as well and just force them to take a bit more poison damage. Next up we have Ash Greninja. Now this is a bit of a weird example because Ash Greninja obviously is going to threaten Galarian Weezing with Hydro. But like I said, we may see a special defense increase. We could see, you know, a lot of Galarian Weezings running a lot of Spidef to check the things that fairies do like to check. But the main point here is that base Greninja won't be able to activate Battle Bond with, presumably with neutralizing gas in effect, which is big. We're gonna have to see, like, if when Weezing goes down, will neutralizing gas no longer be active? Will that activate Battle Bomb? We're gonna have to see how all these sort of mechanics play out, but it is an interesting option. A potential suicide option if you are about to lose them onto Ash Gren and you don't want it to Mega, essentially Mega, if you don't want it to turn into Ash Gren. So interesting option there. Next up we have Megamore. Now this is a big one. Megamore, obviously it does have Iron Head. It will threaten you know, Galarian Weezing with its Stab Iron Head, but it won't be hitting with huge power. It'll be hitting with just base 105 physical attack, which makes a massive difference because yeah, even when invested, like, Megamore is still pretty strong, like reasonably strong even without huge power, but that's laughable damage factoring in, you know, Galarian Weezing having access to Will-O-Wisp, having access to Flamethrower and Fire Blast. So that's very interesting. It can pivot in on player ups. It's going to be taking like 2 damage from just from 339 player ups. That's going to be really interesting, and that sort of ties into the next mon we have here, which is Azumarill, another mon that is very reliant on its ability to actually achieve constant, reliable damage output versus pretty much the entire draft meta. So again, just neutralizing huge power. It has the potential to wall Azu. Obviously Azu has luring sets with Whirlpool, Perish, Trap, etc. But Galarian Weezing has a Sludge Bomb to wear this thing down to 2 KO with investment. Again, if we see a special attack increase, Azu is not going to be trapping Galarian Weezing, and Galarian Weezing is going to be neutralizing you know, regular offensive Azumarill. So huge. You can already see the versatility that from a defensive standpoint that it has in a lot of the key offensive threats, but we're going to continue on. So next up we have Superior. Superior, contrary, it's the reason why it's used, unless you're using the God set, Coil, Dragon Tail, Sub-Synth, but yeah, we save that for DPL. So regular Sub, obviously just using its Leaf Storm contrary set to Domino, kind of Domino sort of snowball out of effect, out of control. Yeah, Galarian Weezing just shuts this thing down, meaning that it's gonna just function as a normal a normal SERP without Contrary with Overgrow, and that is going to be huge. Obviously Subseed still a bit annoying, but the fact that this thing can pivot in and remove and prevent SERP from getting Contrary boost in the first place is huge. It does again place pressure on SERP to be built in such a way to be able to take on a neutralizing gas Weezing, so that's important to consider. And then obviously, you know, Weezing being able to comfortably 2KO SERP with Sludge Bomb is going to be pretty big. Next up, we're going to touch on regen, and regen is an issue in mons that a lot of people have had a lot to say about. A lot of people really don't like regen, and they think it's broken. They think it's too much. I'd argue more so in standard format. In OU, it's a bit more prevalent, but you do see regen cores spammed, here and there in draft. And mons like Taunty is incredible. I think this mon is comfortably top 10 in the current Gen 7 draft meta. It's just so good. I've used it myself. And regen is at the cornerstone of that. Obviously its speed and versatility is nuts, but regen being able to function as a bulky pivot thanks to regen is just huge for it. And removing Taunt's ability to get that HP when it switches out is pretty big. Like, that's massive. That turns rocks into an actual hindrance to this mon. It means that it won't be able to switch in all the time. Obviously, you know, Weezing's going to require a lot of speed F investment to be actually able to reliably take hurricanes and, you know, pain split off damage. But like I've echoed many times in this video, we may see stat changes, we may see more speed F, which would help Weezing, you know, achieve that role. But yeah, being able to resist knockoff and U-turn, which are two very spammable moves by Taunt, is also pretty nice for Weezing. Threatening it with Toxic, you know, and whatever other moves Galarian Weezing may get. Then we have Pex, Big Pex, one of the best mons in Gen 7, and a fantastic abuser of Regenerator. Galarian Weezing being able to soak up its T-Spikes, being able to potentially trap it if it gets a trapping option, being able to, and yeah, mainly being able to remove its regen is massive. Pex really does rely on its regen, not as much as Taunt because it does have access to reliable recovery in Recover, but it does really appreciate getting that 33% back every time it switches out, and it really does help it take hazards into a hit every time it comes in on an attack. So yeah, being able to remove that regen with Galarian Weezing is pretty big. Galarian Weezing will be switching in on Pex in some cases if T-Spikes are set, you know, versus your team. You know, there's a good chance you'll be switching in to remove those and removing Pex's Regenerator in the same sort of turn. So very nice. But we see Tangra here. Now Tangra is probably the mon that is going to be hurt most in terms of regen mons by the presence of Galarian Weezing. Galarian Weezing's typing and potential stat spread is just going to be nasty for Tangrowth to take on. Obviously, regular Weezing smashes Tangrowth, but Galarian Weezing too is going to do a great job threatening it with Toxic, Sludge Bomb. Potential setup if it is graced with setup, we'll have to see on that. But yeah, being able to just nullify Regenerator again, just massive. Then we have Weather. Weather is an interesting point to tie in here. But Galarian Weezing's Fairy typing, allowing it to pivot into Crunch from T-Tar, not fearing obviously Pursuit. It can take Stone Edges pretty well due to it potentially having the same defense as Weezing, which is really nice. And removing T-Tar's Sand, which is huge. I don't know if it's going to actually nullify the Sand, like end it, or whether it's going to just prevent T-Tar from setting Sand when it comes in. We're going to have to see how that plays out. I don't know if it's actually going to just cancel the Weather or not, but it certainly will prevent T-Tar every time it switches in. Like say it were to switch in on Weezing, it wouldn't be able to activate the Sand. So we're going to have to see how weather effects do play out with the mechanic of neutralizing gas. But if it does have the potential to cancel Sand, as I sort of touched on earlier with cancelling terrain, that is going to be huge, but we're going to have to wait and see. Then we have Pelle, same story here. Pelle is going to be threatened by T-Bolt from Galarian Weezing. I'm pretty sure base Weezing gets T-Bolt, which is pretty crazy coverage with a fairly good special attack. Pelle obviously underspeeding. I think it underspeeds. I think it underspeeds base Weezing, or it might, or yeah, Weezing's like reasonably fast, I think. So yeah, Pelle is obviously going to be threatened with T-Bolt, and not being able to set Rain is obviously massively detrimental to Rain teams which just rely on Rain to function. Rain team without Pelle, Rain team without Rain is yeah, it's nowhere near as potent as under rain. So as a lot of rain teams do, especially in tournaments, tend to be built centrally around rain with maybe a couple of offensive threats that can function outside of it, but the real kind of base of the team is under rain. So that's pretty massive. We're gonna have to see. Now this is the final sort of section of this video is going to be covering megas that actually rely on their abilities to get their the best out of their offensive prowess. So first up we have Pinsir. Now removing Pinsir's Aerialate, I'm sort of going to be repeating myself for all these mons here, but I'm going to dive into each mon sort of more in depth. So Pinsir, the reason it's so good is because it gets Flying Stab on normal coverage. Return, Double Edge, Quick Attack, that's the reason why Pinsir's used. Without it, it's going to be significantly worse. It's going to be pretty much unviable versus Weezing. Obviously it does have EQ, which it can use. I mean, it can break past Weezing its draft, so you can build around it, but the fact is that it actually forces that pressure. It forces that approach in building where, you know, if you're having to run SD EQ to get past Galarian Weezing as opposed to just running SD Return, that's less move slots to run something like Knock or Edge for Zapdos, or, you know, Close Combat for Heatran with Balloon. Obviously EQ would hit Heatran too, but you get what I'm saying. Like there are a lot of things you have to account for with them on like Pinsir. It's something I've used myself back in MPL Season 5. That really is the beauty of flying coverage. When you can run like a mono flying coverage or mono flying coverage plus, you know, one other coverage move like CC or Close Combat, you're not having to worry about running like three or four different coverage moves, because flying is so universally splashable, apart from Rock and Steel and Electric, which are pretty easy to wear down with the rest of your team. So pretty interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how Pinsir is impacted by that. Then we have Gardevoir, who obviously will lose its Pixelate. Again, having Psychic to actually threaten Weezing means that Weezing is by no means going to be a Gardevoir counter, but you could see it work as a pivot into Hyper Voice from mons like Gardevoir, being able to pivot in and then pivot out to a Psychic resist. Food for thought there. Then we have Altaria. Altaria is literally checked by Galarian Weezing. Galarian Weezing's poison typing, meaning that its Pharaoh moves are going to bounce off. Not to mention that Pixelate is going to be cancelled, so any sort of return or body slam or hyper voice shenanigan that Altaria wants to run is going to be nullified. It's going to be forced to run stuff like Moonblast, if it even gets Moonblast. I think it might. And then obviously its Dragon coverage is just negated by Galarian Weezing's Fairy typing, so that's huge. That is massive. Again, you don't really see Altaria run that much in draft, but you know, it is around, so it's something to consider. Then we have Megamore. It's not allowed in regular draft leagues, but you know, some leagues do allow Ubers, and again, just negating its flying typing. Pretty similar story to Mega Pinsir. Really does reduce this mon's ability to break through teams, as it does rely on stuff like Return and Double Edge to really get the most out of its damage potential. And then lastly here we do have Heracross. Heracross needs its skill link to really break through teams that can resist its Fighting Stab, and that is kind of the main way it gets around fairies. Typically it uses Rock Blast to get around mons like Clef, and without skill link there's no guarantee that you'll get 5 hits, and that does definitely hinder Heracross's damage potential. Obviously, you know, you can still get lucky and roll 5, but it's a real sort of gamble there. And the fact that Galarian Weezing is able to switch in and take does actually resist Close Combat 4 times is pretty insane. That attack is going to be bouncing off. It also does resist Bug 4 times as well. So yeah, we're going to see Galarian Weezing really potentially put a hindrance on a lot of different mons in the draft format, a lot of different offensive and defensive mons. You know, I could be wrong. This is just my opinion as the way I see it. We don't have true stats for Galarian Weezing yet. I'm just making assumptions based on the current Weezing that we have. You don't tend to see like regional variants completely change up their stat spread too much, maybe here and there, but for the most part their stat spreads are tweaked just slightly to reflect the sort of nature of their different forms, I guess. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, I could see Weezing's special attack and special defense get a bit of a boost, while its physical attack falls, and maybe its physical defense falls like 10 points or so to compensate for the boost in its special stats. So that is my kind of just my thought process here. I think I am excited to see how this thing can be used in the format, and I think potentially it could be a real gem, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you guys thought of the video and what you guys think of Galarian Weezing. Whether you think I'm right, whether you think I'm wrong. Maybe I've missed something that you think a way that Galarian Weezing could be used. I'd love to hear it. Drop a like on the video if you enjoyed, and yeah, definitely let me know what you guys thought in the comments below, and I'll catch you next time.